Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Riprap, the academic book television program. My guests today are Jennifer Granholm and Dan Mulhern. Today we'll be talking about their book, A Governor's Story, which discusses the economic challenges that occurred while Jennifer Granholm was Michigan's top political executive. Welcome to Riprap.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
As we were talking before the program, I think this is a really well-written book.
Well, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Coming from you, that means a lot.
Yeah.
A connoisseur of all good writing.
Yeah. But what's interesting, you took the genre of autobiography and then you made it a serious reflection. And maybe you want to talk about why you did that and how you did it.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, it's co-authored. It's in my voice because it is a governor's story, but Dan really, who is a very thoughtful person, brought out a lot of the more personal aspects of running a state during a time of crisis that probably are more interesting to people. My tendency would not be to do that. My tendency would be to go right to the policy and, go like that. But Dan, I think, made the book much more interesting. The reason why we wrote this is because every day we open the papers and we see what the president is going through and what the country's going through. And we think, we have been there. This is exactly what Michigan experienced through the first decade of this century. And I think that Michigan's story is illustrative for the country. It has a lesson for the nation in terms of what we learned, what we did, and what we didn't do, and what worked and what didn't work.
It was fascinating to see. You had great detail, which I always enjoyed. But to see the people who are going through the crisis. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one thing to talk about possible GM bankruptcy in the abstract form or in terms of news and newspaper magazine articles. It's something else with a person who has the responsibility to try to not make that happen.
For sure. I mean, the personal stories of Michigan citizens, it's why this book is really on sort of three levels. There's the personal level of Dan and I, and then there's the level of what Michigan citizens were really experiencing on the ground. And then there's a level of Michigan being the canary in the coal mine for the nation.
One of the fads of the hour in the management field was MBWA, management by walking around. And a governor walks around a lot. So whether it's plant floors or state parks or wherever, you saw a lot of people. And it wasn't uncommon, Jim, to sometimes when Jen was with family and sometimes by herself, to have the kind of one-on-one encounters, a few of which are in the book, that really brought this book to life, brought Jennifer's political struggles and the economic struggles to life in really profoundly human ways. And hopefully that comes alive in the book.
Well, and that's what makes the book really interesting. Mm-hmm. It's not abstract statistics and stories about generalities. There are specific people mentioned, in specific towns like Greenville and what it's gone through. Right. And then your different, experiences with that, and it turns the whole notion of an autobiography kind of on its head. It's not a self-indulgent narrative of what I want to do and my disappointments or victories. It's really a larger frame kind of situation.
Well, Jennifer couldn't claim victory on the one hand, and didn't want to shift blame, really. I mean, this is a book about people's genuine struggles, because people in Michigan had to and have to reinvent themselves. But in a way, it's also a story of Jennifer's and to some degree my reinvention too, that we were just regular people in a really, really difficult circumstance. And so, I think she did a great job of not telling platitudes or trying to write some legacy that the journalists are always worried about, what's your legacy, but instead to give people a sense of the personal drama and also, of course, the bigger political and economic issues that Michigan is grappling with.
Just to be really candid about.
Well, I thought it was frankly really courageous, and that you talked about what Frank Kelly told you about do what's supposed to be done and let the rest of it sort itself out. And I think that sorting itself out part, the legacy is still coming out. I don't think people still quite understand what the thing was. But what always bothered me during your governorship was the thing of the little present that John Engler left behind that nobody knew about, the $2 billion package. When you come into office and you think it's one set of circumstances and you arrive and find out it's something much different, the state doesn't have $2 billion in some account that can just wash
we
that all
wish
away.
We did, but it was it was a gift that kept on giving, and and then compounded, of course, by globalization and the experience of losing all of these manufacturing jobs, and what the auto suppliers were feeling. They were just reeling from all of this, and then it all culminates in 2008 when the auto industry goes bankrupt. So it was. But all of that being said, there is a hopeful end. In Chapter 10, we put some very specific recommendations that we think are important for the nation to learn from what our experience was. And so it's not all bad, because I think that there is some good news now coming from Michigan.
Well, I didn't think it was bad. I thought what you did was really, like I said, courageous and very hardworking, and people are just beginning to understand that now that the current governor is starting to work his magic, and they're starting, wait, it doesn't add up. It just does not, and when it doesn't add up, there's nowhere to hide in a state budget, as you're only too well aware that there's not much flex at a state level.
Right. States are having a lot of hard times.
The question is, you signed up to be the governor, but what led you into that decision?
A lot of soul searching for both of us, really. Maybe you could tell the story about the priest.
Oh, well, should I tell that story? Nah. I mean, what led you into... Jennifer always had a deep sense of public service, and really when we met, I could hardly get a date because she was so busy with first year of law school, but on top of that was so involved in the movement to have Harvard, where we were in law school, divest its holdings in companies that did business in South Africa. So she was a complete and total activist at the time I met her.
The president of Harvard's name was Derek Bach. Derek Bach, get the word. This is not Johannesburg.
So there you have it. Jennifer was protesting and working hard in school. And we met and expected to come back here to Michigan, to my home that I love, to my 7 siblings and 60 cousins, and one day maybe I'd run for governor. And so we'd kind of talked about that. We both knew we were interested in public service, and we were meeting with the priest in preparation for our marriage. And after the first 2 sessions, in the third session, he was sitting across the table from us, and he said, "What happens in 8 or 10 years if the party comes to Jennifer and they say, you'd be a great candidate, there's an open state Senate seat, and you're a lawyer, and you're smart, and you went to Harvard, and you're photogenic, and you're communicative, you should run for state Senate." And he said, "Dan, how would you feel about that?" And it was a terrible wake-up moment for me, Jim, because I felt like I'd just been hit by a 2x4, and here I was marrying the person I could never beat in an election.
Fortunately, we never had to run against each other.
Right. But we kind of thought that I would get involved in politics. But Jennifer did such great work as an assistant U.S. attorney and as corporation counsel to lead a huge county government's law department. And just as that priest predicted, one day people in the party, friends of ours, came to Jennifer and said, "There's an open seat going to come for Attorney General, and you're a lawyer, and you've done criminal work and civil work, and you're communicative, and you're so great, you should run." And I said, "You should run." And so we had a long conversation. Our kids were only 6, 5, and 1, I think, at the time, or 7, 6, and 1.
Yeah.
Our son wasn't even a year old, so it was going to be a big shift. But Jennifer had such a heart for public service.
If it weren't for the fact that Dan was willing to take responsibility for and be the father at home, and not as Attorney General so much, but as governor for sure, because that's really an all-inclusive situation. And as any governor knows, whether you're a man or a woman, the family needs to be protected, and the family needs to have a strong presence. And Dan was willing to sacrifice a huge amount to be able to enable me to do that. Obviously, that's sort of the personal stuff, and we are both driven by the notion that you have a responsibility in this world to leave it better than you found it, and this, sometimes when a door opens, you go through.
And you had great passion, having been a prosecutor and attorney general, was a big drive was to really get upstream and educate children better and create stronger cities and economic development. Of course, there was almost no ability to proactively do that, no financial resources, no budgetary resources. And instead, obviously, Jennifer had to play defense, as you were suggesting, with $1.7 billion shortfall the first year. And year after year are those budgetary shortfalls. And then how do you what can a governor do to help stimulate an economy so that there is some tax revenue? So you really got thrown. I mean, and you still did great things for education, but had to do everything without any resource to speak of.
Anyway.
When we talk about leadership, I was reminded of George Washington and when they first asked to be president of the country and he said no.
Right.
And
Why would I do that?
Well, I think if you're going for the top position and you understand what leadership requires, you're not going to be a real fanatic about that. You take it on out of a notion of service.
Right.
But when you really understand what leadership entails, then you have some reservations because you know what the price you're going to pay.
Well, and I'm trying to recruit people all the time to run for office, particularly women, because women have to often be asked and invited to run. And I say to them, one, remember that it's not about you. It's about the change that you want to see in the world. It's a form of service to your country and to your nation. And when you come out of serving, you're not always expected to come out unscathed. Yes, it will be hurt, but it's not about you. It's about the greater good.
I think Washington's kind of a rare case because most men, I count myself as one of them, don't have to be asked to run. I wanted to run, and I think
it's a guy thing.
An awful lot of guys do want to run, but they find out soon enough that public service is enormously challenging.
That's why women are often really, really effective, some of the most effective people in the legislature. Because it's not about them, and they recognize that it's not about them. And a lot of times for guys, there's an ego thing that goes along with it. Whereas often, and again, this is stereotype, because there's a lot of men for whom this is not true, and women for whom it is. But women often are the people who are in the back rooms making, licking the envelopes, making things happen for campaigns, and they're often behind the scenes, making the thing work. And that's why they're effective legislators, because sometimes they do the hardest work of all, which is to reach across the aisle, to build coalitions, to be able to get complex pieces of legislation through. Whenever the most complex pieces of legislation that I had, I would always go to a couple of women in the legislature who I knew.
Well, now the truth comes out.
Who I knew could pull it together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I teach writing, which is what I do, I find that there's some fascinating research on silencing of women in the classroom, and like Mary Catherine Bateson and others. Because it's a male-dominated power structure, women hesitate to offer anything in the classroom unless they get their complete, coherent answer together.
Right.
Guys will say anything.
That's so interesting.
It's interesting. I just had an experience with this last week in my course that I teach on leadership at Berkeley in the business school, and I put up a big continuum on the board from red hot to cool blue, and red hot was I take risks, I challenge authority, and down to the other end of blue, which is I'm risk averse, I don't like to rock the boat. And I had all the students, I had 25 students, come put an X somewhere on that continuum where they thought they were, how much risk could they tolerate and did they like to tolerate. And as they were doing it, I couldn't help but notice where the men and the women were. And so after they were done, they sat down and I said, I'm going to go over the X's and tell me when I'm at your X on the continuum. So I started to put F, F, M, M, F, F for female or male. And on the middle, I had a bunch of people in the middle, but on one end, I had all men who were risk hot, give me the risk, and the women were concentrated cautious at the other end. And we talked about that. We'll continue to talk about what does that mean for leadership. What's the risk for men in general in being aggressive and taking on risks, and how do men bring women into the conversation when they may not naturally go that way as quickly and as assertively. So we've all had the same experience, all three of us in different ways.
When you're running for an office that many, like you were one of 29 who'd been elected governor of a state in this country, you're a little more concerned about, well, what's this going to mean? Because there's not necessarily precedent for all the things you're going to be going through.
For sure.
And I think that's fascinating, and that's what led me to this reflecting on the structural and political factors you encountered when you took office.
Well, this, when I first came in, and we recount that in the book, we thought that we were going to emerge from the national recession. This was in 2001, 2002, the nation was in a national recession. And the economists, when I get there in January of 2003, we bring all of the economists to Lansing to tell us what the economy is going to look like for Michigan so that we can balance a budget, we can put our budget forward based upon the experts' projections. And the economists all said, oh, we're in a national recession, we're just emerging, Michigan will bounce back. That whole thing when the nation catches a cold, Michigan catches pneumonia, but when we bounce back, people buy cars and, we do fine. Well, at the end of the first year, they projected we were going to have net job growth and it was just going to continue to go up after that. And all my advisors were saying, you are coming in at the best time. You're right in the valley and you'll be able to take credit for all these jobs that are created down the line. And at the end of the first year, I'm like, okay, where are the jobs that are supposed to be coming in? And that's when I get this call from the MEDC about Greenville, which is, just quickly for your viewers, Electrolux leaving Greenville, going to Juarez, Mexico, because they could pay $1.57 an hour. And what we put on the table was zero taxes for 20 years, helping to build them a new factory. The UAW, who represented the workers, put unprecedented concessions, and none of it was enough to be able to keep this manufacturer inside of the U.S. And when that happened, it just struck me so hard because it said to me that with all the tools that we have, even with zero taxes in this country, what does it mean for all these manufacturing jobs if they can choose to go somewhere else so much more cheaply? If we can't compete, it means that we have to take a different approach to creating jobs in the United States. And really, this book is a journey of that learning, of how is it that you can crack the code to create jobs in America in a global economy.
Well, plus the supposed reduced cost is not entirely true, because there's a lot of other costs, like what happens to the economy you leave behind, where people are losing houses, losing
Absolutely.
jobs. We have more homeless than ever. We have more in poverty than ever.
Right.
So we're paying a price. And then when you're down there, the factories are not necessarily that well run. And the supplies aren't all that good. So, and then you have to get it back. You have to get it trucked on back into the States. So
right. It's not as easy an equation as just a bottom line cost equation, and certainly the cost of the U.S. We're seeing it in the reaction in Occupy Wall Street and all of the frustration that people have with this long-term unemployment and the hollowing out of the middle class. That hollowing out of the middle class is due to the structural changes that are happening beneath the nation's economy, which is not just the loss of manufacturing jobs, now the loss of service jobs, because the global economy has enlarged the playing field. And when multinational corporations have to provide return to their shareholders and take advantage of developing markets, if they can move, they will. And we have to realize that in this country, that if we continue to have this hands-off posture, that we will be really accomplices to the continual loss of more jobs. We got to get in the game.
Yeah, let me just dwell on that for a quick second on the problem side and the solution side. Your point, Jim, and Jennifer's point about the problem side is when you lose Electrolux, you lose a lot of stuff like service, you lose restaurants. We're talking a town, Greenville, of 8,000 people and a factory that's employing 2,700. So the devastation is huge for everything that surrounds it. And that problem gets played out in Mexico, because down there in Juarez, Electrolux is not by itself. There's a whole complex, and they're pulling all these suppliers, and drawing them. We need to learn that on the upside. So what Jennifer was really trying to do was really cluster some of these industries here, like the battery industry, because if you get the assembly group, you're going to have a greater chance to pull in all of the component pieces and create that clustering. A lot of the world gets that. When we have a hands-off government notion about it, keep the government away, then we lose that opportunity. So
in fact,
it may make sense for an individual manufacturer to do this or to do that, but they're not looking at the bigger systemic issues. And that's what we're trying to argue in the book is the government has a role, as it does in China. We're not going to do it the same way they do it in China, but they clearly have a role in building economic development. And we're not thinking that. A lot of people say, get the government out, have the government go away. Then leave it to whom?
I was moderating a panel of CEOs, multinational CEOs like Coca-Cola, AT&T, John Deere, earlier this year. And I said to them, what should be the role of government? you guys do work all over the globe. Who does it best? Who has got the best model that the United States should copy? And you know what they all said? They all said it was Singapore. And I said, well, what is it that Singapore does that we don't do? And they said, first of all, they've taken an analysis of their assets and their strengths, and they build on those strengths. They create clusters of development, and then they go after companies around the world that fit into their economic strategy. And so they have a handshake to every company that comes that builds upon their economic development cluster strategy. They streamline permits, they offer access to capital so they can get their technology and their equipment in the ground. They have an overall active strategy. I'm like, well, that sounds like a pretty active role for government, doesn't it? I mean, it's crazy that we have this notion that if you have your hands off of everything, that somehow it will all come back. Not when our economic competitors have a very hands-on role in a helpful way to make them competitive in a global economy there.
Well, I think the whole notion of outsourcing is an illusion. For example, when GM thinks it's going to sell more cars in China, there's a penalty you pay when you deal with China, and they have to have a Chinese subsidiary, and they have majority ownership, so they get access to the technology. Then they turn the technology around and build their own thing. So we're losing two ways. We're taking the market over to there, and they're getting the technology, which is the major reason for people to buy our stuff.
And people say, I mean, and is that a free market? That's not a free market. I mean, the globe, our competitors are not hands-off. They're hands-on, and China's an example, a perfect example of that. I was in China in March, and I met with a number of Chinese officials on the issue of energy and why they were being so successful in getting all of these solar panel makers and everything in there. And it's not just about wages. And during one of the presentations, a Chinese official pulls me aside and he says, so when do you think the United States is going to get a national energy policy? And I said, I don't know. We got a divisive Congress, the Tea Party. And he does this. He says, take your time.
You notice we're starting to have electric cars.
Yeah.
But we don't have the charging stations.
And, you know, we got a partnership with the federal government through the stimulus, and we talk about this in the book, so that Michigan was able to be now the center of North American manufacturing of the electric vehicle, which is the battery. But unless we build out the infrastructure, unless we follow up with trying to be independent of foreign oil, i.e. get the electric battery, the electric car in the United States, then we're going to be ceding all of that territory to China too.
But that was one of your victories, is getting the battery grants that you talk about in the book.
Right.
Michigan got most of them, if I remember.
Right, more than half of all of them. In fact, you know, and we wouldn't have been able to do this as a state on our own. It was only the partnership with the federal government and the decision by the Obama administration and the Department of Energy that we wanted to create a United States battery cluster. And we said, we're going to be the place where that happens. So we partnered with the private sector. We competed for those, meaning us and the private sector jointly competed for those stimulus dollars. We got more than half of all the stimulus dollars. And in a year and a half, we were able to get 18 companies to build batteries in Michigan, suppliers as well as assembly, as Dan was talking about. And we developed the supply chain. I mean, a battery has an anode, a cathode, electrolyte, separator material, and companies that build all of those pieces. And if we had a gap in the supply chain, I went to Japan and I got Toda to come and build cathode material in Battle Creek, and went to Japan and got Techno Semichem to come and do electrolyte. We went to South Korea and got LG Chem to come here and build the battery in Holland. You know, without that active nature, we would not have had that at all.
Those are some of those seeds you talk about.
Those are the seeds. You know, leadership, we say, is a Chinese proverb. Leadership is planting trees under whose shade you will never sit. But I do feel very good about what we did in trying to build that cluster out. And I just hope we continue to support the infrastructure for it.
Dan, one of the interesting things was this gender role reversal thing that you had to go through, which a lot of my students are going through.
Right.
You know, when they lose their job and their wife is working, now they're going to school or trying to find some other way to do it. So while you did it voluntarily, it still is sort of emblematic of what a lot of people are going through.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to see more and more of it. 60% of the undergraduate degrees are being awarded to women. Women are getting the majority of degrees out of law schools and medical schools. So it's here to stay. And I think an awful lot of guys are and were like I was. I grew up and changed, but they sort of still have a presumption that they're going to be the breadwinner and they're going to be the main person. And often to their disadvantage, I think, really. I learned it in some ways kind of the hard way, I guess, is that, as we were saying before, I expected I would have a high profile public job. We both love our children so much and wanted them to have a lot of hands-on support, so we flipped. That became my role, not by choice, not in the same way that Jennifer really chose to be in the public sector, but mine was more responsive or reactive, reflexive to that. But in the long run, Jim, it was a fantastic thing. Jennifer has much better field general skills than I have, thinks systematically, can manage 50 things at once. She was made to do the job that she had as governor, especially in these brutally difficult times. She has a positivity and a drive that were really outstanding. But I think one of the things we learned in the course of this is that I had skills that were family-oriented skills. I'm a great nurturer. I'm very physical with my kids and with people. I like tangible touch. I can be very flexible. I can set my own stuff aside and respond to what children need at any moment. So there was a list of skills.
Very patient.
I have a patience with kids, probably more than with politics, that comes out. So in the end, it was really a story of great opportunity, and that in a crazy way, that priest who said, Dan, what happens if Jennifer's the one who leads, might have said, Jennifer, what happens if Dan's the one who could really be great raising the kids? Would you make room? But we don't think that way still. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for those young men. It's a great challenge because men are still schooled and socialized to be providers, to be tough, to be strong, to be in control. And in this market, in this job market, it's hard to be tough, strong, and in control. It's one thing when you could go to a factory line and show your strength and your willingness to take on the risks, or you could go to the organization like Ford and work in white collar for 40 years, once you got in the door. Now it takes what I think women tend to have, which is the ability to adapt and be flexible and shift around and build long-term relationships. So it's a fascinating world. I could go on forever and bore every viewer we have.
Because when you talk about this in the book, you had consciously structured this. This was not an accidental thing. It was not mandatory, but you both decided what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Yeah. And I thought that was really pretty impressive. But a lot of couples are having to go through this.
I know
given a global world.
We're running out of time, I know.
Sorry.
But really, we've got some very specific ones. But I very much believe in a partnership with government in identifying your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a SWOT analysis. Every smart business does it. The U.S. has to do it too. States have to do it all the time. Instead of Michigan competing against Texas or Ohio or Illinois for jobs, which is a stupid strategy nationally, because all you're doing is moving jobs around inside the country. We need to enlarge our economy by developing a competitiveness strategy that enables us to go abroad and bring jobs back here, as well as develop the sectors that we know regionally we will be competitive in. So I hope people buy the book.
And thank you for being on.
You bet. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us, Jim.